transatlantic slave trade. It was supposed to be a statue of reconciliation between the enslaved and those who were their captors. So I just wanted to point attention to the statue as we walk past. We will move forward. Lumpkin's jail, which was, I want to say they rediscovered this site, 2005? 2008, they did an archaeological dig that rediscovered this place was actually the resting place for the Devil's Half Acre, or what it was known to be as the Devil's Half Acre. The spot was owned by two other former slave traders before the famous Robert Lumpkins, but he was described as the most notorious, or what you would call a bully slave trader. If anybody is familiar with dog fighting or dog breeding, this is the way that they looked at us in that time. So the property was first known to be owned by a man named Bacon Tate, which was around 1833. Tate deeded the lots 62, 63, and 64, which would have been this space, and probably two spaces over, to a fellow by the name of Lewis A. Collier, who was also a fellow Richmond slave dealer, and he had extensive connections with plantation owners throughout the South. In 1836, the value of the buildings increased from $3,000, then jumped again to $5,000 that following year. It peaked at $6,000 by 1840. In 1837, Collier pledged the lot as collateral for a loan from Bank of Virginia. And in 1844, the bank seized the property and found a willing buyer in Robert Lumpkin. 36-year-old Lumpkin was attracted to Collier's property because it exactly suited the particular requirements of his business. In addition to the brick dwelling house, Collier had added a number of additional buildings, which may have included guest quarters, a kitchen/tavern, that were documented on the site in the 1960s. Most importantly, though, Collier also had built the two-story brick slave jail while developing the property in the 1830s. Lumpkins took over Collier's existing commercial complex basically by the site of it. He didn't have to do any development basically, because after he bought the property, there was no development done on the property. You could say that because the property value went down, so he couldn't have built anything extra. Everything that he needed was already here. Thus, although Lumpkin may have been the most notorious owner and operator of Collier's jail, it had already been in operation for several years. That's pretty much the points. That's the main points I have. Oh, it's a little touchy subject about Robert Lumpkin's wife, because some people say that it was love, or that was his wife, and then he actually listed her as a person who just lived with him in his will. That's what he actually listed her as. So it's not really clear the relationship that was actually between them two. But he did go on to leave his property to her, and actually bought property for her and the children that she had. I want to say it was 5 by him in Pennsylvania, because he was a little scared that she would be sold, or their children would be sold into indentured servitude or slavery. In 1873, Mary Lumpkin sold the Wall Street lots to Andrew Jackson Ford and his wife, Mary Lucy Ford. It appears most likely that the jail building had been demolished by 1876. In 1892, Richmond Iron Works was on the site. Eventually, the northern section of the freight depot was removed. The lots were paved over as a parking lot, sealing whatever remains of Lumpkin's jail and the subsequent buildings below ground. But like I said, the archaeological dig rediscovered this little area in 2008. But that's all I have.
In 2003, the defenders, along with some other folks, decided to start a campaign to mark the site of Richmond's African Burial Ground and the story of Gabriel's rebellion, because it was on this site that the city gallows once stood, and where Gabriel, along with others, were executed for their role in the conspiracy to rebel against the city of Richmond, against the governor of Virginia, and tried to bring an end to slavery. The historic marker is directly above us on Broad Street. And one of the most interesting things about starting this was coming to understand the processes. And I think that one of the pieces to this whole struggle is the idea that we are actually fighting for physical sites, for the right to tell our story and the right to this history. But we are also fighting to assert our right to the process, how decisions get made. And this was one of the steps for doing that, because there was really not a struggle to raise the money. There was really not a struggle to get an historic marker placed. But there was a tremendous struggle over the language of that, of the historic marker. And there was a real back and forth with that, because who interprets and tells the story is one of the key factors in how we understand our history. So the Department of Historic Resources historians wanted to tell it from one perspective, and we wanted to tell it from a different perspective. We were trying to reclaim Gabriel as a hero of the people in the battle for liberation and justice. They were trying to portray Gabriel as a failure. So I'd like, if each one of us could identify throughout the history of any history that you know, those people that get identified as heroes when they are the conquerors, and those who get identified as failures because they end up giving their lives for the struggle, you understand what you have to wrestle with. And that's people versus system. That's people versus institutionalization of a particular story. So the struggle to reclaim Richmond's African burial ground, the struggle for accurate information, the archaeology that was done on Lumpkin's Jail was really fantastic, and is actually a very good example of what we would like to see happen. Because when we look around here at these parking lots and the broken pavement and these chain link fences that other people put up, and the things that go on down here, I don't see desolation. What I see is promise and potential, because so much of what is rich and real and concrete about Richmond's history, we walk on it and engage it and touch it every single day. We just need to make it visible, and we need to insist that the people that believe that they're in control of the process understand that we are a part of the process, and that we also need to understand that this is not new. And if you haven't, you really, really, really need to, if you can't get to New York, go to the website and visit New York's African Burial Ground. Because the interpretive center there is not just about the history of what happened there in the 1600s and the 1700s. It is about how the people of New York claimed that site and said, oh no, you are not going to do it that way. You are going to do it this way. And they fought for 20 years. Okay? So there is no winning these battles overnight, and there is no winning with your first effort. This is when you get your inspiration that these things are worth fighting for. Richmond's African Burial Ground was in existence or in operation from somewhere in the early to mid 1700s until the year 1816, when it was closed essentially at the request finally of petitioners in the black community saying, we don't want this site anymore, it's full, you don't let us do it the way we need to do it, and we need a private cemetery where we can respectfully bury our people. That cemetery is the Barton Heights Cemetery, which is now seen as an historic cemetery, and I don't think it's actually used anymore. But it's a beautiful cemetery if you look at it. It's this rolling hill site, and there are a lot of historic people who have been buried there. In addition to the subsequent cemeteries that we know a little bit more about, like Evergreen, where some very famous people, and in particular very famous people in the black community of Richmond, are also buried. These cemeteries are not being as well cared for as they need to be. When we put focus on this cemetery, it is also by example to say we need to be looking after those cemeteries as well. But this cemetery was very important and shows up in a lot of readings and a lot of historic material. There was a man who was a free black man in Richmond in the early 1800s he was one of those people that you call a gadfly. He was always at the city council meetings. He was always calling people out. He was always telling them what they weren't doing right. And in one of his letters, he wrote to them saying, I know you lost this petition, but these people in this community still want a new cemetery, and we are asking that you pay attention to that fact. He would write about any number of things. His collected papers, the letters and everything that he wrote are...
Standing now is right in the footprint of where the stadium will be, and that street there behind me is 17th Street. 17th Street. I've got 4 additional slave trading sites that are in the footprint of the stadium, and there are about 7 more which are across Broad Street, where they're also going to put up, I don't know, it looks like an apartment building. Y'all have seen this in the newspaper. And some other associated buildings to go with the ballpark. There's going to be, and I've just put in the ones that go back to Marshall Street. There's some more further back that are going to be obliterated by whatever buildings they're putting up, parking decks, hotels, whatever. But the 4 that are here are on this side of 17th Street, and we know that there was at least 2 where that gas station is. So I think that what happened was from the earliest time, it began to consolidate inward towards 15th Street. But these were viable slave sites during the Civil War that were here right in the footprint of where they're going to play ball. And another thing to point out is a lot of the sites weren't necessarily selling slaves. Can you do it right? But were involved in slave hiring. Also, not everybody that wanted to sell their slaves sent them to the auction house. A lot of them were embarrassed, and they would have them sold privately, and there were a lot of different businesses around town, concentrated mostly in this area, that would do a private sale so that you wouldn't be embarrassed in front of your neighbors. So there was a lot more ways to deal in slaves besides running an active slave auction jailhouse. I've got 97, I think, slave dealing sites in the whole database. That's 97 of people who dealt in slaves one way or the other. There were also a lot of businesses down here that dealt in things like outfitting slaves and clothing, work shoes, things like that. So it's a whole picture, it's a whole culture of how slavery was working and buying and selling and outfitting and renting out. A lot of people rented out their slaves to try to go ironworks or to the tobacco factories. And those rentals were carried out by agents down here. So you can see that there's a lot more down here than what you're being led to believe.
You said 97?
97.
And that's in Shockeo Bottom?
Yes.
Right. I just wanted to outline that.
And that's going from like 12th Street to 19th. The majority are in 15th.
You like to talk about where Omohundro's was?
Yeah, Omohundro was, I think, right across from the Exxon station. Omohundro is just a very famous slave trader. But some of these guys did a lot more slave trading than Omohundro. Even though he's better known, there was one called Hill and Dickinson, and they were always having auctions. Hector Davis, And he not only had his own business, he worked for several other auction houses. So these guys kind of move around too. But the really active ones were Hill and Dickinson. You don't see that much about Lumpkin. I think Lumpkin was actually renting out his jail and his auction services to other people. Because sometimes they'll say, we're going to have a slave auction at Lumpkin's, or apply at Lumpkin's, for this sale. So it's a lot more complicated and involved than you would think. You get the picture from movies of they're having a slave auction, they bring the people up, have an auction, and you don't get anything more of it. Who made the clothes for these people? Who transported them? Hardware. it had to be obtained from somewhere. And all of that, they had blacksmiths down here, livery stables, all of them who served, maybe not exclusively the slave trade industry, but certainly were involved in it. That's why they located themselves there. Also, sometimes if you're riding around like we do, if you go up 18th Street to a block across, I guess that's Marshall, there's a whole bunch of buildings that are old livery stables. They're really neat, and you know that they predate this century just by looking at them. And a lot of that's worth looking at. Some of the buildings you can look up and see that they were here long before the Civil War. And I don't know that they had anything to do with slaves, but they certainly were here at the same time. And who knows, somebody else may